The maple trees outside St. Michael's Hospital had already turned by the time my daughter's life changed forever. I remember staring at them through the waiting room window, thinking how strange it was that something could be so beautiful and so wrong at the same time. Claire was 31 years old. She was a registered nurse at the same hospital where she now lay in the trauma unit, which felt like the cruelest kind of irony. A transport truck had run a red light on Yonge Street during the first October snowfall. The driver walked away. Claire didn't walk anywhere for a very long time. I'm 64 years old. I've buried a husband, raised 2 children on my own in a 2-bedroom apartment in Scarborough, and worked 30 years as a school secretary before retiring. I know what it means to stretch a dollar until it apologises, but nothing in my life prepared me for sitting in that hospital with a notepad, adding up numbers that refused to make sense. The spinal injury was incomplete, the doctors told me. That was supposed to be the good news. With aggressive rehabilitation, Claire had a real chance at walking again. The physiotherapy alone would run $800 a session, 3 times a week, for at least a year. There were specialist consultations, adaptive equipment, modifications we'd need to make to her apartment. OHIP covered the hospital stay, covered the surgeries, covered the acute care. But rehabilitation beyond a certain point, the specialists at the private clinic said, the kind that would actually get her back to herself, that fell into a different category entirely. My son Daniel called every night from Calgary. He wanted to help, but he had 3 kids and a mortgage that was already breaking him. I told him we'd figure it out. That's what mothers say, we figure it out. Claire's savings were gone in 2 months. Mine followed shortly after. I was looking at a second mortgage on my condo when a man appeared in the waiting room one Tuesday afternoon in November. I noticed him because he didn't fit. Everyone in a hospital waiting room looks like they belong to something hard. This man wore a charcoal coat that probably cost more than my monthly pension. He was perhaps 70, silver-haired, and he moved carefully, with a cane, as though each step required a quiet negotiation with his own body. He looked around the room until his eyes found me, and then he walked straight over as though we had an appointment. My name is Walter Ashford, he said. He didn't sit down until I nodded at the chair across from me. I apologise for the intrusion. I understand your daughter is Claire Novak. I told him I didn't know any Walter Ashford. He said he knew that. He said he'd been following Claire's case through a mutual contact, a surgeon he knew on staff. He said he had a proposition and that he understood completely if I wanted him to leave, immediately after he'd said it. Then he folded his hands on his knee and told me he was dying. Pulmonary fibrosis, he said, the progressive kind. His lungs were slowly, irreversibly scarring. He'd been given 8 months, possibly a year with careful management. He had no family. His wife had passed 11 years ago. His business partner of 40 years had retired to Portugal. He was, by his own quiet admission, entirely alone in a way that he said had become harder to bear than the illness itself. He wanted to get married, he said, not for love, not in the traditional sense. He wanted someone in the house, someone to share meals with, someone who would be there. In exchange, he would cover every cost of Claire's rehabilitation, every session, every specialist, every piece of equipment, whatever she needed for as long as she needed it. I told him he was out of his mind. He said perhaps, but the offer stood. He slid a business card across the seat between us and stood, slow and careful, and left. I sat with that card for 2 days. I turned it over and over like it might say something different if I looked at it from another angle. I called Daniel and didn't tell him about it. I sat beside Claire's bed while she slept and watched the machines track her breathing and thought about what I was actually considering. On the 3rd day, I called the number. Walter Ashford's home was 40 minutes north of Toronto, out past King City, where the lots get large and the trees close in around the laneways. The house wasn't a mansion in the showy sense. It was old stone, Georgian, surrounded by white birch trees that were bare by then, their pale trunks standing like quiet witnesses. It looked like a house where serious people had lived serious lives. His housekeeper, a woman named Edna, who was perhaps 10 years older than me and moved like she'd been in that kitchen since Confederation, made tea without being asked and set out shortbread on a plate that had probably belonged to someone's grandmother. She didn't say much, but she looked at me with eyes that were doing careful arithmetic. Walter and I sat across from each other in his study, which smelled of wood smoke and old books, and negotiated the terms of something neither of us had a proper word for. He was direct and unhurried. He asked nothing of me except presents. Separate rooms, no performance of affection, no obligations after he was gone except to take whatever he left in the will, which, he said with a dry precision that I would come to recognise as his version of humour, would be considerable. I asked him why me? Not someone younger, not someone without a daughter in a rehabilitation centre, not someone without all the complications I came bundled with. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you looked like someone who understood what it meant to keep going anyway." He'd seen me in that waiting room 3 times before he approached me. He said I read paperbacks during the worst of it. He said that told him something about a person. I didn't know what to say to that, so I drank my tea. We were married 10 days later at a registry office on Yonge Street. Edna and Walter's solicitor served as witnesses. Claire didn't know the real terms. I told her I'd reconnected with an old friend. She was too deep in her own recovery to ask many questions, which broke my heart and relieved me in equal measure. The first weeks were exactly as strange as you'd expect. My life had been small and routine for a long time, and suddenly I was living in a stone house with a dying man I barely knew, surrounded by rooms full of art I didn't recognise and books I'd never heard of. Walter worked most mornings in his study. I would hear him on calls, that measured, precise voice carrying faintly through the walls, still running the investment management firm he built over 4 decades, even though he'd nominally retired 2 years before. He emerged for lunch, which Edna prepared and left in the kitchen, and we would eat together in a silence that was not exactly comfortable, but was at least honest. He coughed. That was the constant background of those weeks. A dry, persistent cough that came in waves and left him looking briefly hollowed out before he composed himself again. Claire's rehabilitation began in earnest the 2nd week of December. The clinic was in North York. I drove her 3 times a week, sat in the waiting room reading, watched her come out exhausted and furious and quietly hopeful by turns. The physiotherapists were extraordinary. The costs were extraordinary too. And for the first time in months, I wasn't doing arithmetic in my head every time I thought about the next appointment. That should have been uncomplicated relief. Instead, it sat in my chest like something I hadn't earned. Walter noticed, I think, before I said anything. One evening in early January, I came home from the clinic and found him in the kitchen, which surprised me, because he never came into the kitchen in the evenings. He was attempting to make tea and making a quiet mess of it. I took over without thinking. He sat at the table and watched me. "How is she today?" he asked. "Better," I said. "She stood without the bars for 30 seconds. He smiled then. Not a polite smile, a real one, with something warm in it that caught me off guard. We talked for 2 hours that night. About Claire, about Daniel and his kids, about Walter's wife Margaret, who had apparently been the one person on earth who could make him laugh at himself. About my husband Ron, who had died of a heart attack at 52 and left me with 2 teenagers and a grief I'd had to portion out very carefully because there wasn't time for all of it at once. Walter listened the way people who had been genuinely alone for a long time learn to listen, like it mattered. Like he was storing it somewhere careful. After that, evenings changed. We ate dinner together most nights. Sometimes we watched the news and argued mildly about things. He had opinions about municipal politics that were very strong and occasionally wrong, and I told him so, which seemed to delight him. He lent me books and asked what I thought of them. I told him when I thought they were pretentious, which was more often than he expected. But something was bothering me by February. Walter was getting worse faster than the timeline he'd described. He told me 8 months to a year, and his doctors, he said, were cautiously optimistic about the slower end of that range. But I could see it. The coughing was worse. He was sleeping more, missing his morning work hours. Something Edna said she'd never seen before. His appetite was going. I watched him at dinner push food around his plate and thought about the man who'd eaten 2 servings of Edna's beef stew in November. I mentioned it to Edna one morning. She frowned at her cutting board. "The medication changes," she said. "His specialist keeps adjusting things." "Which specialist?" I asked. She named a Dr. Brennan, said he'd been Walter's pulmonologist for the past year, said his son Garrett, Walter's estate manager, had brought Doctor as estate manager, Brennan in after the diagnosis. I hadn't known Walter had a son. Edna's expression did something complicated. "Estranged," she said carefully, "for many years. But Garrett came back when Walter got the diagnosis. Walter was glad of it. He wanted to make things right before the end." Something about the way she said it made me set down my cup. Garrett visited twice a week. I'd seen him, a man in his mid-40s with his father's grey eyes and a handshake that was slightly too firm. He was pleasant to me in the careful way of someone who had decided to be pleasant. He brought the medications every Monday. Walter's specific supplements and the adjusted prescriptions from Dr. Brennan, he said, because the pharmacy his father had always used didn't carry the particular formulations. He was very thorough about it. Very attentive. I started paying closer attention. There were things that didn't fit together neatly. Walter had described himself to me as estranged from Garrett for nearly 20 years over a dispute about the firm, about money and decisions Garrett felt he'd been shut out of. A man like Walter didn't reconcile that easily or that quickly. But when I watched them together, Walter deferred to Garrett about the medical management in a way that seemed unlike him. The same man who argued with me about Toronto City Council and read legal briefs for pleasure was accepting medication adjustments without asking questions. I asked Walter about it one evening. He was tired, more tired than usual. He said Garrett had made the effort and that mattered to him. "Doesn't it seem strange that your condition is progressing so much faster than they predicted in the fall?" I said. He looked at me. He said bodies don't always follow predictions. I lay awake that night. I thought about the pills Garrett brought, the particular formulations, the private specialist who hadn't been part of Walter's care until Garrett arrived, the estrangement of 20 years and the sudden devoted return. The next Monday, after Garrett left, I took the weekly medication bag before Edna put it away. I told her I would handle it. She looked at me with those careful eyes and didn't say a word. I drove to the Shoppers Drug Mart on Bathurst Street and asked to speak to the pharmacist. The pharmacist was a young man named Dev, who took the bags from me and started going through the bottles. He got quiet very quickly. "Some of these are fine," he said, "but this one." He held up a small amber bottle. "This isn't a pulmonary medication. This is a high-dose immunosuppressant. And at this dose, combined with these other prescriptions," he looked up at me. "If someone with lung disease were taking this regularly, it would compromise their immune system, make them far more susceptible to respiratory infection. It would accelerate exactly the kind of decline you'd expect to see in a pulmonary fibrosis patient. It would look entirely consistent with disease progression." I asked if it could be intentional. He said he wasn't going to speculate. But he said I should talk to someone. He said it quietly and with the particular seriousness of someone who understood the weight of what he was being asked. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time. Then I drove home and called Daniel. I told him everything. He was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Mum, call the police." The RCMP came to the house the following morning. Walter was confused, then alarmed, then very still in the way he got when he was thinking hard. He looked at me across the kitchen, and I saw him working through it piece by piece, the same methodical intelligence he applied to everything. They took blood samples, they took the medications, they spoke to Dr. Brennan, who it turned out had lost his medical license in Ontario 4 years earlier for overprescribing and had been operating under a colleague's credentials. Garrett had found him. The investigation took 10 days. Garrett had found him. The investigation took 10 days. Garrett was arrested at his condominium in Yorkville. On his laptop, they found correspondence with a wealth management firm in Vancouver discussing the potential acquisition of Ashford Capital following Walter's death. Correspondence that had begun 3 months before Walter's diagnosis, before anyone outside the family should have known it was coming, which suggested strongly that the diagnosis itself had been manufactured, or at least aggressively encouraged. Walter had a mild pulmonary condition. The hospital's own specialists confirmed after a full independent assessment. Manageable. Not terminal. Not even close. Walter spent a week at Sunnybrook. He was angry in a way I had not seen from him before. A cold, controlled anger that he mostly kept below the surface and let out in short, precise sentences. He asked the nurses almost nothing, and the detectives almost everything. He was already from his hospital bed calling his lawyers. On the 4th day, he asked me to sit with him. I came in the afternoon when it was quiet. He looked better already. Colour in his face. The cough nearly gone. He said, "You didn't have to stay." I said I wasn't sure what he meant. He said, "I mean, you could have taken what I offered and left once things became complicated. Most people would have." I thought about that. I told him that I'd spent 40 years watching people get through things they didn't think they could get through, and that it had left me with a low tolerance for abandoning situations just because they got hard. He was quiet for a minute. Then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that there is no obligation whatsoever, and that whatever you answer, I will honour completely. Our arrangement was for a specific circumstance that no longer exists. If you want to end the marriage when I'm discharged, I will make certain you and Claire have everything you need. Full stop. No conditions." I looked at him in that hospital bed, this man I'd eaten dinner with for 3 months, this man who had told me about his wife Margaret and about the business he built and about the 20 years of silence with a son he'd tried to make peace with. This man who argued about transit policy and asked what I thought of books and listened like it mattered. I told him I'd been thinking about his garden, that it had clearly been neglected, and that I had opinions about what should go where come spring. He stared at me. I told him I'd always wanted to try growing tomatoes and that I'd heard the soil north of the city was decent. He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and it was the best thing I'd heard in a long time. Garrett pleaded guilty the following spring to fraud and criminal negligence causing bodily harm. Dr. Brennan's colleague, whose credentials had been misused, cooperated with the investigation and received a conditional discharge. Walter's lawyers spent the better part of a year unwinding Garrett's access to the estate accounts, which had been more extensive than anyone knew. Walter and I stayed married. Not because of the arrangement which we both agreed had expired somewhere around the 2nd month, but because somewhere between the arguing about city council and the late evenings in the kitchen and the drives to Claire's appointments, something had quietly become real without either of us making a formal announcement about it. Claire walked without assistance the following August. She came into the kitchen of the stone house, which she had started calling Mum's house, without seeming to notice the shift, and walked across the tile floor and hugged me so hard I had to sit down. Walter was in the garden doing very little actual gardening and mostly supervising, and Claire went to the back door and called out to him, and he looked up and I watched his face do something unguarded and gentle. Daniel brought the kids at Thanksgiving. The stone house held them all, somehow. Edna made enough food for twice as many people, as she always did. and Walter sat at the head of the table looking like a man who had recently remembered what a table full of people felt like. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood at the kitchen sink doing the last of the dishes, and Walter came in to dry, which he had taken to doing despite Edna's pointed disapproval. He said, "I owe you an apology." I asked what for. "For the presumption," he said, "of thinking I could structure something this large and this human as a simple arrangement." I handed him a pot to dry. I told him I had made the same presumption and that we were even. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was working up to something. He said, "I would like very much for this to be permanent. Not the arrangement, just this." I looked at the dark window above the sink, at the white birch trees just barely visible in the yard light. I thought about the waiting room at St. Marn, Michael's and the business card, and the 2 days I'd spent turning it over in my hands. I thought about all the things I'd managed without expecting anything at the end of them. I told him I thought it already was. He put down the pot and stood there a moment, and then he put his arm around my shoulders, careful and certain, and we stood at the kitchen sink of that old stone house while the October wind moved through the birch trees outside. And I thought that this was the thing about getting older that nobody tells you, that you stop waiting for life to arrange itself into the shape you planned for it, and you start noticing what it actually is, right now, in this kitchen, with this man, with the dishes done and the family asleep upstairs and the trees moving in the dark. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. I keep thinking about the drive home from that shopper's drug mart on Bathurst Street, the parking lot, the dark, the bag of medication sitting on the passenger seat like something that needed to be handled carefully. I sat there longer than I should have. I knew what I was holding. I knew what it meant. And I also knew that the moment I made that call, everything would change in ways I couldn't predict or control. That's the thing no one tells you about paying attention. It costs something. I've thought a lot in the time since about why things unfolded the way they did. Not in a mystical sense, just in the plain practical sense that actions have consequences and that the choices people make tend to circle back around eventually. Garrett made his choices over years, a long, patient calculation built on the assumption that no one would look closely enough. That assumption was the crack in the whole structure, because what he didn't account for was a 64-year-old retired school secretary who had spent 30 years watching children closely enough to know when something wasn't adding up. I think about Walter too, about what it took for him to sit in that waiting room and approach a stranger. There was a kind of integrity in that, in being honest about what he needed instead of pretending he didn't need anything. He could have hired a companion. He could have managed in silence the way he had for 11 years after Margaret died. Instead, he walked across a hospital waiting room and told the truth about his loneliness to a woman he'd never met. That took something, a willingness to be seen that I don't think came easily to him. And Claire, I watch my daughter walk across a room now, and I still feel it, that particular tightening in the chest that I don't have a better word for than gratitude. She worked so hard, through the sessions when she came out furious and exhausted, through the plateaus that lasted weeks, through all the mornings when the distance between where she was and where she wanted to be felt impossible. She kept going anyway. That kind of persistence doesn't come from nothing. It comes from a decision made quietly and repeatedly that the effort is worth it, that you are worth it. I think that's what the three of us had, in different ways. Walter had the honesty to say what was true, even when it was uncomfortable. Claire had the stubbornness to keep working when working was hard. And I had, I suppose, enough of my mother in me to pay attention when something felt wrong, and to do something about it rather than look away. Those aren't remarkable qualities, they're ordinary ones, but they're the ones that held when everything else was uncertain. The willingness to tell the truth, the willingness to keep going, the willingness to look closely at the people you love and notice when something isn't right. I grow tomatoes now in the raised beds Walter had built along the south wall of the stone house. They're not spectacular tomatoes. Walter says they are, but he's biased. I pick them in the late afternoon when the light comes low through the birch trees and the garden smells like warm earth and green things. And I think that this is what a life can become when you pay enough attention and refuse to give up on it. That's the whole of it, really. That's everything I know.